CT. We'll start with some basics, just very briefly, and then move on to coronary calcium score, CT, coronary angiogram, and its various uses. The newer modalities, that is CT FFR and CT perfusion imaging. And then we'll end with a brief discussion on CT in cardiac structure, especially in the TAVI era. So I think each of this could be a potential question. So basics again, this is we all know this. I'll just a refresher. So CT was started in 1971, the invention of CT. It's got an interesting history behind it, but that's probably for another day. So earlier, what we had was the electron beam CT, which is the EBCT, which is not available anymore. EBCT is of historical interest, but this was what was used to do the calcium scoring in the early days. Now we've got the multi-detector CT with its various slice systems, ranging from 16 all the way to 320. So obviously, as the number of slices increase, the cost goes up. But with it brings a lot of improvements, which is reduction of motion artifacts. There is an increased volume of coverage from 2 to 3 centimeters earlier to now about 14 to 16 centimeters. It's also reduced breath hold times. But nonetheless, a lot of artifacts remain, which include motion, beam hardening, etc. So, I mean, we know that the X-ray has about the 180 degrees of motion, which is the basic requirement in order to generate good 3D images. So, briefly on CT potentials, the tube potential is measured in kilowatts, which as the kV increases, the tissue penetration increases. The photon count is how much photons are produced in the X-ray tube, measured in milliamperes or current. And as the MA increases, the better quality of images are produced. Obviously, with increasing kV or MA, the radiation dose increases. So what is resolution? Resolution is of three types. One is spatial resolution, which is nothing but the thickness. 64 slice CT, what we have, could potentially give a slice of zero point 0.5 to 0.8 mm. Again, compared to cine angiogram, which is quite less. The temporal resolution is nothing but time, about 160 to 220 milliseconds of total cardiac motion can be elicited. And temporal resolution is of importance when we are talking about things like 4D scans, which is again very important in the TAVI era. So volume coverage, as I said, 2 to 3 centimeters in the 64 slice CT systems to now about 18 centimeters in the 320 slice. So that means, the gantry does not need to move a lot. And in very little time, we can actually achieve a good volume of the heart and then further reconstruct.
Varun, what you told about
Coming
temporal
to image,
resolution?
temporal resolution is the time.
Yeah, that is there. This thing, some four
I'll
times
come
that
to it
of.
later. I'll
Okay.
come to it later. So, moving on to the next part of the basics, which is image acquisition. We'll discuss it later, but briefly, the heart rate should be less than 65. Beta blockers, oral or IV, can be given. Ivabradine is also being used these days. The second issue is that we have to be aware of things like blooming, which is common in case of patients with a lot of coronary artery calcium. So we have to make sure that there is no blooming. There is no coronary calcium to begin with. Again, for vasodilation, sublingual nitrate should be given prior to the CT being done. Moving on to gating. Gating is briefly of three types actually, but two is what is commonly used. One is the gating is basically by using ECG. The first gating which has been used for a long time is the retrospective or the retrospective gating. In this, the full sample data is initially acquired, and then retrospectively it is gated to the ECG, the various cycles of the ECG. So it's quite easy to understand that because the full sample is actually acquired, and using the ECG we can manipulate the image data set over various time periods, systole, diastole, various the first heartbeat to the third heartbeat, etc. So 4D imaging is possible. So with this brings the problem that we have to give a lot of radiation to begin with, because we are actually doing the imaging in a couple of heartbeats throughout the phases, systole, diastole of the heart. So there is more radiation. Coronaries can be imaged in all phases. That's the most important thing here. So coming to the other type of gating, which is the prospective. Here we don't use the term gating. Instead, we use the term triggering. So here the radiation is given to the patient only at specific ECG windows, usually at the mid-diastolic level. So how this is calculated is by using the prior RR period. So based on the previous ECG and the previous RR interval and the heart rate, a reasonable time period, time window is constructed uh, for the future, at which time radiation is delivered. So this brings a reduction of about 80% of the total radiation dose. But however, because we are imaging only in very few specific points, 40 data cannot be acquired. Obviously, when the heart rate is very high, we cannot do this. The other gating is the fast pitch helical scanning, in which I mean, as we can imagine, the Z axis is nothing but the movement of the gantry in and out of the CT coil. If we can adjust this Z axis as the scanning system rotates by actually increasing the movement of both the Z axis as well as the helical rotation of the scanner, it has been found that both the radiation doses can be reduced, scan times are reduced, but we can also try to get a 4D sequence. These are available in the newer generation machines, not in the older generation. Moving on to image interpretation, briefly, we know that what we are usually aware is the 2D plane image, both the coronal, sagittal, or axial cuts. Volume rendered VR imaging can also be used. For coronary imaging, we have to understand that there are two specific type of reconstructions. One is the multiplanar reformat or the curvilinear multiplanar reformat, which is specifically used for coronary imaging. The second one is the MIP projection, which is the maximum intensity projection applicable to both CT and MRI. Again, to identify coronaries in much more clarity. I think radiation was recently discussed, but again, briefly, to complete it, we can probably look at it in two specific ways. One is stochastic or as a continuous variable. The other is a deterministic, which is a binary, yes or no. You either get a problem or you don't get a problem. Stochastic is an issue because even a smaller amount of radiation could potentially offset a bigger problem in the future. So we have to use the ALARA principle, which is as low as reasonably achievable. That is when it comes to radiation. We have to use prospective triggering, reduce the z-axis access time, that is improve the speed, reduce current. I mean, earlier the CT-CAG used to be about 5 millisieverts. The total cardiac CT was about 16 to 20. For comparison, CAG conventional is 7. Angioplasty itself was only 15. But now, thanks to various improvements, less than 3 millisieverts is all total coronary CT-CAG takes. So it's pretty good. I think CAN will be discussed later, so we're not going to talk about it now. What about non-cardiac? So when you do a cardiac CT, a lot of other things are picked up. Things like lung cancer, patients with pulmonary nodules, clinically significant extracardiac findings in this particular study was a good 22%. So when you're doing a CT, you probably have to also look at the other things. These are just a representative bunch of images from the chapter in Braunwald. This is the VR or the 3D reconstruction, as we all know. This is the MIP projection. These are multiplanar reformat views, looking at the two arteries in two different planes. So obviously, a CT, you can also look at other views, an oblique cut, coronal, sagittal, what have you. So this was just a brief basics. We all know this, just to highlight. So we'll now start discussing about specific parts of the CT or the questions. First is the coronary artery calcium score. So the coronary artery calcium score actually predates both the CT-CAG and the MDCT. It's been in vogue since the 80s, late 80s. So what is done is an EBCT was earlier done, and this would directly give an idea about the calcium load of the patient. But the electron beam CT is a different thing in that there is no helical rotation of the CT machine. The temporal resolution was very high because of the fact that there is no rotation, but it gives a very poor spatial resolution of just 2 to 3 mm. So which was not good enough to image the coronaries. So coronaries were totally unclear by ABC. So about the 90s, a lot of people realized that the coronary artery calcium could actually be used as a surrogate to look at the total plaque area. So this two pictures here sum it up well, that the calcium which was actually found through the CT actually had a direct correlation to the total amount of plaque area. And it was also found that the coronary artery calcium was probably a very sensitive risk factor in comparison to the other traditional diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia sort of a risk factor. So that in that way, it could be potentially used for risk stratification. These two principles actually brought about a lot of change, and a lot of studies also came out, as we will see. What are the methods? So it's coronary artery calcium is a non-contrast, it's a plain CT. Earlier done with electron beam, but right now it's done with the routine ND-CT machines. It just 1 second or one breath hold is enough. It's prospectively triggered. So the volume acquired is from the MPA bifurcation to the apex of the heart. That is pretty much all the places where a coronary could potentially be. It is taken in 2.5 to 3 slices. The tube potential is 120 kVp, and the total time of the scan is 3 to 5 seconds. Usually does not require usage of any pre-medication. The radiation dose which is given to the patient is roughly about 1 millisievert, which is less than the total background radiation that a patient may get in sea level. So after the CT is done, what the report we get is the Agatston score, which we all know, which quantifies CAC as a function of two things. One is the total area of calcium and the total density of calcium as measured by Hounsfield units. So basically, the Agatston score is a sum of area of calcium in all the coronaries. So various stratification methods are available. This is what is given in Braunwald, 0, 1 to 10, 11 to 100, etc. But for our understanding, we can look at it as 0, where there is no calcified plaque whatsoever, or more than 0, which is again stratified into 3 types. First is 1 to 99, which is mild calcium, 100 to 399, which is moderate, more than 400, which is severe. A lot of studies have looked at calcium as they please, basically. So a lot of studies have looked at CAC more than 600 as being severe, more than 300 as being severe. But the current understanding is this. So there are a lot of other scores. As I said, CAC is nothing but a product of the total area of calcium and the total density of calcium as measured by the Hounsfield unit, which is more than 130. So it can be looked at in the way of volume. So it could be a calcium volume, mass, density score. These scores are not being used. So briefly on the pathobiology of coronary artery calcium, the earlier accepted theories was that it was a passive thing, where aging actually directly caused vascular calcification. I mean, it probably is true even now, but now we know that there are a lot of other potential mechanisms in action. One, the fact that the atherosclerosis generally uh, can cause a lot of inflammation has been recently discussed as well. So this can cause it can cause oxidation of lipoproteins on the vessel wall, produce calcium. This can alter the local paracrine autocrine mechanisms, increase morphogenic proteins, cause calcification. There are a lot of genes which are upregulated. These are ossification genes. This can lead to calcium. So on and so forth. There are a lot of theories behind it. Just briefly on it. So a lot of studies have looked at the coronary artery calcium and the relationship of CAC to obstructive. Uh, so it's been well established at this point that it's got a very high negative predictive value of close to 100%. So if the CAC is 0, that means the chances of that person having coronary artery disease is almost 0%. So there are a lot of population-based studies actually were the ones who have looked at CAC. So these are the various studies. We'll just briefly take a look at them. So as we all know, MESA has been something which has been going on for the last 20 years or so. Over 1,000 publications have been actually published from the MESA group. So the MESA study also looked at CAC. This was one of the earliest studies to do so in 2000. So 6,000 patients. It basically looked at what's coronary artery calcium does to patients over a long term. So it was found that as the CAC increases, it actually predicts the worsening CV outcomes. This was proven without doubt that it was beyond the traditional risk factors. So a rough doubling of CAC score, that is just a numerical doubling, would actually increase the probability of a coronary event by 25% at 4 years. The second study to look at it was the Haynes-Nixdorf recall study done in Europe. again had a very similar conclusion to the MESA study. As the age increases, the CAC increases. As the CAC increases, so does the CV mortality. The next one was the Rotterdam study group. This was also a long-term population-based study, which also came to the same conclusion. The last study is the Framingham study. This was a subsequent cohort of the Framingham. That is, this was the Framingham offspring study, which included the third generation cohorts of the original Framingham group. All these offsprings were subjected to NDCT. In addition to looking at simple CAC, these guys also looked at a number of coronaries with coronary artery calcium, and they also looked at whether the coronary artery calcium in proximal vessels signified worse prognosis than when they were at the distal levels. And this actually, the number of coronaries and the location of the CAC actually predicted major CHD. So the studies which we must be aware of is these four: MESA, HNR, Rotterdam, and the Framingham cohort, third cohort. There have been other studies as well, including the Cardia, ARIC is still going on. So all of these have come to pretty much the same conclusions. That as the aging increases, CAC increases. As CAC increases, so does the CV risk. So what's the deal with zero calcium? So the issue is, if the patient have a coronary artery calcium of zero, the Agassiz score of zero, again, a lot of people have found that the CAC doubling time, that is the CAC, takes a while for it to convert from zero to more than zero. So they have looked at what happens to patients if the CAC remained at zero, with a comparison to patients whose CAC was actually more than zero. So it's been found that it gives a good warranty period. That is, if the CAC is zero, your chances of you developing significant mortality-inducing coronary event, which was measured at various time points, was quite less. We'll come to it in a little while later. So a lot of meta-analysis have been done, which proved that coronary artery calcium of zero actually predicted an event rate of just 0.47% at 50 months. And if your coronary artery calcium was more than zero in comparison to when it was zero, it gave an 85% absolute risk reduction for future events when it was zero. So this was another study which actually looked at a good high number of patients. Coronary artery calcium of more than 400. It was found that just the fact that CAC is more than 400 actually increased cardiovascular events, even when you compare it with patients who are having more than 3 traditional risk factors. And this study also found out that if the CAC was zero, the total amount of coronary events actually came down. So briefly, in patients who are asymptomatic, if we are actually doing a coronary artery calcium to understand if they have a risk factor for a future CV event, the CAC of zero is quite predictive. That is, the event rate is only 0.47% at 5 years. So what about in patients who are symptomatic? Patients have chest pain, stable ischemia, who have had an ACS in the past. Symptomatic patients, the coronary artery calcium has very little value. This has been shown by various studies. So how do the trials have any say when it comes to coronary artery calcium for decision making? So even in 2013, the guidelines were unsure. It was a 2B recommendation when, despite the CAC was actually, it may be considered just to inform treatment decision making. So subsequent consensus statements have not given it much value. The only thing is the SCCT, which is the Society of Cardiovascular CT. These guys have given it a reasonable higher recommendation, especially in patients whose ASCVD risk was 5 to 20, as we'll see in the subsequent pages. The ESC, at least in the CCS 2019 guidelines, give a 2B recommendation for screening in asymptomatic patients. The dyslipidemia guidelines, as we all know, has included the CAC as a 2B recommendation as a risk modifier in CV risk assessment in low to moderate risk patients. So as of now, no risk score which Framingham assigned. None of the risk scores actually includes or incorporates CAC except for the MESA risk score, which not a lot of people use. So what about the progression? All these trials have found that they actually progress at a reasonably high pace. A lot of studies have found that they progress slowly, so a lot of heterogeneity in this. But what we know is that CAC progresses. And what if we do CAC at two different time points, which is maybe spaced by 5 years? So this is the 00 population, in which if the CAC is zero at two different time points, the 10-year risk of them developing a CV event was only 1.4%. So a 00 population probably does well. So now that we have all this data on CAC, how do we reconcile all this data with therapies? Because that's what we end up doing. So there's not a lot of evidence here, but people have actually looked at statins, aspirin, and other drugs. Evidence for statin is from a subgroup of MESA patients, about 950 of the original cohort of 6,800. In these subsets, they applied the Jupiter trials inclusion criteria, which was LDL less than 130 and HSCRP more than 2. They found that at 5 years, to avoid the major cardiac risk, outcomes, the number needed to treat when the CAC was 0 was 124. But when your CAC was more than 100, the number needed to treat was just 19. So there's no reason why we really shouldn't be using statin in this subgroup at least. So what about aspirin? Again, the MESA guys have looked at it. So this was a group of patients for whom they came up with CHT risk using the Framingham risk score. The blue line here means a CHT risk of less than 10%. The red bar here means a CHT risk of more than 10%. This was 5-year numbers using the Framingham risk score. The red line here is the number needed to harm when you're giving the patients aspirin, that is measured by bleeding. So as we can see, when the CAC is 0, even if you treat these patients with a significantly high Framingham risk score, the number needed to treat was very high, close to almost 1,000, which reached the number needed to harm line. But however, when we look at patients whose coronary artery calcium is more than 100, the number needed to treat was hardly about 50 or 60 in patients with less than 10% as well as more than 10%. Of course, these will be called into question considering we have newer evidence on aspirin, but just something interesting to see. People have looked at aggressive BP control in patients. So coronary artery 0, when you incorporate a very aggressive BP control, number needed to treat was 99 to avoid CV risk at 10 years. But patients who had a significantly higher calcium score, the number needed to treat was far less. This was just when they looked at BP control, but still interesting to see. A lot of other studies, this was a prospective study, the St. Francis Heart study, looked at patients. They gave a cocktail of statins, vitamin C, and E versus placebo. At 4 years, there was no difference. But when they did a subgroup analysis, specifically looking at patients whose CAC was more than 400, it was found that there was a significant p-value for CV outcome. So what about clinician and patient behavior when you're facing a patient who has a CAC report? So this was the Eisner study, which actually looked at this. It was found that patients who actually did not undergo a coronary artery calcium scan, their 5-year Framingham risk score actually increased because these patients were found to be overweight, etc., etc. But patients who have just undergone a CAC, they didn't specify what the outcomes were. Just the fact that you've undergone a calcium score actually brought about a lot of change in health behavior. So people took statins, took aspirin, they watched their weight, lifestyle improved. So the Framingham risk score actually did not increase over the next 5 years of follow-up. So can a coronary artery calcium calculated just from a CT chest? So the Society for Coronary CT actually gives a class 1 recommendation to at least report a qualitative, not a quantitative score, so as to risk stratify these patients. CAC can also be identified by using a SPECT, but it is not very accurate, but it can be done. So this was a proposed algorithm from a JACC review article. So in patients whose 10-year ASCVD risk falls between 5 and 20, so it was found that when your CAC was 0, the recommendation is that statin is not recommended. But when the coronary artery calcium is more than 0, then these group of patients or whom we can actually modify the treatment plan. That is, we can potentially add a statin. So this was what the EAC has also mentioned as a risk modifier. So when we are using the ASCVD risk score, we can use the coronary artery calcium as an additional point in order to guide statin treatment. But it's just an idealistic way, maybe not be followed in our practice. So that was about coronary artery calcium score. We'll now move on to CTCAG. So CTCAG is nothing but coronary artery angiogram. So it's a non-invasive alternate, excellent to exclude CAD, etc., etc. It's got a very high specificity. The negative predictive value is very high, close to 100%. So when CTCAG says that your coronary arteries are normal, they're normal. You don't have to do anything further. So again, briefly on the procedure. Here, unlike the coronary artery calcium, where we never actually bothered with heart rate control or vasodilator cocktails, here we have to worry about it. So heart rate has to be controlled. We have to pre-medicate with nitroglycerin. Allergy protocol needs to be carefully followed. So the what we normally do here is a three-phase protocol, in which the first phase, 40 to 60 ml of contrast is given at 5 ml per second. We wait for some time. Then a second bolus, that is a 50-50 contrast mixture is given, about 10 to 20 ml in this case. And after some time, we follow it up with a saline bolus. So this is the three-phase protocol, which is even followed here. So the total contrast volume is about 50 to 120 ml in adults. In pediatrics, when we do a structural CT, it's about 1 to 2 cc per kilogram. So how do you time it? I mean, when you give a bolus, how is it timed? So it's time based on bolus tracking principles. As the contrast enters the aorta, the CT attenuation value in aorta suddenly shoots up to 110 to 180. This is noted by the CT machine. And then after this, the acquisition is triggered over the area of interest, which is the heart. What is the scan protocol? Initially, a scout picture is taken, then coronary artery calcium is assessed, following which vasodilation is given. Then a contrast test is used for bolus tracking, following which, once we are all comfortable that the timings are adequate, ECG is gated properly, it's triggered for acquisition, then a CT is done and further a reconstruction. Just briefly on the protocol use. I think indications we all know, so we don't have to look at it. So it's probably the same indication as invasive coronary angiogram. So the ACC recommends that we all follow a specific protocol for reporting a CT, which is called as the CAD RADS system. It is a system to standardize CCTA. So all arteries which are more than 1.5 mm are actually taken into account. There are two parts to it. The first part is the CAD RADS category. The second part is the modifier. So we'll just briefly take a look at it. The CAD RADS category is a 5-part category. Scores ranging from 0 to 5. So this is just based on the stenosis, 0%, 1 to 24, 24, etc., etc. So what the CAD RADS tells you is, let's say a patient has a CAD RADS of 2, which we know that the stenosis is less than 50%. We really don't have to do anything further. If on the other hand, the stenosis percentage increases linearly as we move through the CAD RADS category, we actually have to do other things like functional assessment, that is MPI or something, or we have to go and do an invasive coronary angio. When the CAD RADS is 5, which is 100% stenosis, the total coronary occlusion, we have to probably consider a viability assessment at this point. So this is at the CAD RADS category. There are some things called as the CAD RADS modifiers, which is nothing but it could be the notation could be an N, which means it's non-diagnostic. We'll look at it later. The notation could be S. S is used when we actually find a stent in a post-PCI scenario. Graft is when we do a CT for a post-CABG patient. We have to use the modifier G. And V stands for vulnerable plaque, which has been discussed recently. But again, to just briefly mention what a vulnerable plaque is in a CTCA, it has 4 aspects. Anything more than 2 of these 4 probably means that the plaque is a vulnerable plaque, which has a high risk of future events. So it can be a low attenuation plaque, as we can see here. A low attenuation plaque is ideally lipid rich, It's got a very low attenuation, less than 30 horns per units. It's associated with a lot of ACS. The second vulnerable plaque feature is a positive remodeling. Positive remodeling is nothing but an outward enlargement of the vessel at the site of an atheroma. If this is the stenosis, this black area is the outward positive remodeling. Here, the lumen is classically well preserved. The lumen is easily more than 50%. So the positive remodeling has a lot of lipids and macrophages. Maybe it's a little less associated with ACS. The third vulnerable plaque feature is a spotty calcium. Spotty calcium is nothing but a calcium which is less than 3 mm in size. The fourth vulnerable plaque feature is a napkin ring sign. Napkin ring sign is nothing but a region of coronary in its cross section, which includes both low attenuation as well as a high attenuation region. So this confers a very vulnerable nature to this particular atheroma. So this is about the CAD RADS categories, the category and the modifier. So we'll just take a look at a few examples. This first one here on the left, this picture is from Ronwald, I think, I'm not sure. Anyway, so here we see a coronary artery, the RCA in this. There is probably some artifact here, but when we take a look at a different angle, we find that the lumen is fine, maybe a 20% patient. So we give it a CAD RAD 2. So an RCA has a mild disease. Because it was there is no stent, there is no graft, there is no vulnerable plaque, we then give the notation of N. Looking at this picture looking at this picture here,
Varun, we lost you.
Audio. Varun. Varun, no audio.
Varun?
Call Madiyappa. Hello?
Yeah, I called him. Yeah.
Hello. What happened? Long time it is not audible, no?
Arun. ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆಯಾ ನಿಂಗೆ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಿಲ್ವಾ?
ನೀನ್ ಮಾತಾಡೋದು ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಅದು ಅವನು ನನಗೇನೋ ಒಂದು ಸೌಂಡೇ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇರ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಐ ವಾಸ್ ಇವನ್
ವರುಣ್ದು ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದೆ.
ಹಾ?
ವರುಣ್ದು ಬರ್ತಿದೆ ಅಲ್ಲ?
hello.
But we are
Hello, is it better now? Audible?
Yeah.
Venkatesh called me just now. Sorry. I think it got lost somewhere on the way. So I believe.
Second example.
Yeah, I'm just starting the share now.
Yeah.
Is it visible?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah, okay. So I was saying that we discussed the vulnerable plaques. So I thought we'll look at a few examples of the CAD RAD system in action. So this first picture on the left, we can see that this is a multiplanar curvilinear reconstruct of not exactly, but a reconstruction of the coronary artery, the RCA in this case. This part is showing some sort of a signal dropout, but when it was looked at another angle, it was found that the lumen was fine, maybe about 20 to 30% lesion. So we give this notation as CAD-RAD2. We use N here because there is really nothing. There's a non-specific thing. Looking at this other example here, where we see a CT image of the left coronary artery with a stent in situ. So we use the notation or the modifier S here. But because the lumen is fine, there's again less than 50% disease, we use the term CAD-RAD2 here. So the third example, we can see this is the classic curvilinear multiplanar reformat imaging. Here the entire extent of the graft is visualized. So the graft is fine. There is hardly any disease in the graft. So it's a CAD-RAD1 / modifier G because the graft is fine. So coming to this final example here on the bottom right, we see that here again the lumen is fine. There is no disease in the lumen as such. So CAD-RAD1. But we see that there is a lot of positive remodeling. There is some calcium. And if probably we do a cross section here, we may even find a napkin ring sign with low attenuation, high attenuation areas. So this is a CAD-RAD1, but with a vulnerable plaque. So this is how the CAD-RAD system works, and it's been approved by the ACC, and the ACC recommends that it is used. So moving on to a few prospective studies on CTCA versus invasive coronary angio. We need to be aware of these three studies, at least briefly. The first one is the accuracy one. Accuracy and Core 64 essentially are pretty much two sides of the same coin. It was just sponsored by GE on the first, and Toshiba sponsored the Core 64 study. So they looked at coronary angiogram by CT versus invasive coronary angiogram in patients who presented, all comers presented with typical or atypical pain, but with no prior history of CAD. It was found when they even looked at less than 50 or more than 70%, more than 50%, the CT-CAG performed well. The sensitivity, specificity was quite high. As I mentioned earlier, the negative predictive value was quite high. This is the same story in all these three trials. We just need to know that the names and what happened. Of interest is that in the Core 64 trial, the coronary artery calcium of 600 was actually considered to be. So what happens when you compare the CCTA versus other imaging modalities? So we've talked about the invasive coronary angio in those three studies. The eVinci investigators looked at CCTA versus other modalities. That is, they used MPI, they used PET to look at coronaries. So it was found that the sensitivity and specificity were quite high for patients with more than 70% stenosis. So as we all know, I haven't quoted trials here, but in post-CABG populations, again, coronary artery calcium is very good, with a very good sensitivity of more than 90%. And it probably saves a lot of radiation and contrast to the patients and the operators, considering we have to really hunt for the grafts. So in CABG patients, it's almost totally recommended now to use a CCT. Again, we also have to understand that because the ICA is nothing, invasive coronary angiogram is nothing but a luminogram, the atherosclerotic burden is not essentially very clear. So when we can understand that these lesions have external atherosclerotic burden and issues, we can probably come to a good prognostic value. So this has been found in the confirmed registry. So this is an example of how to prognosticate. So as we can see, we can identify that there's a lot of issues here, which includes positive remodeling, calcium, there is low attenuation plaque. So all this will not be found out in an invasive coronary angio. And when a lesion, even if it is a 50% lesion or a 40% lesion, has such significant vulnerability, then we can probably incorporate high dose statins, etc. So this is the same thing. Just further examples, we can take a look at it later. So here, yeah, just to briefly mention, plaque volume is also important. So in these two illustrative examples, we can see that in this picture, there is some lesion here, but when there is probably a high-grade stenosis, maybe 60%, 70%, etc. But the plaque here is not at all vulnerable. So it's probably a it's less likely. But look at this here. The lumen is fine. The stenosis is not significant, but we can see that there is some calcium here. So things like this, minor details are important to prognosticate. So moving on to uses, we can look at it in two forms. At least in case of patients with chest pain initially, one is how a CT performs in the patients with acute chest pain, and how a CT performs in patients with stable IFC. I'm assuming that acute chest pain evaluation in an emergency room is a topic in itself. So we'll just look at how a CT helps. So in patients who have a low to intermediate pretest risk for ACS, that is patients who have non-diagnostic ECGs, initial troponins are negative, symptoms are rapidly resolving. These are the patients who potentially probably are having non-cardiac chest pain. They have a very low probability of ACS, but they still can present with unstable angina. So discharging them without doing any non-invasive test is quite risky. So various modalities are available in a non-invasive testing format, which includes non-stress, that is CT, echo, or stress, which includes NPI, echo, etc. All these can help in risk stratifying, and once the risk stratification happens, we can plan doing an invasive coronary angiogram. So how does CT help? So again, various trials have looked at it. We'll come to it in a bit. But the bottom line is the negative predictive value is still quite high, but the positive predictive value is very less. So we end up over-diagnosing a lot of these patients. Some minor aberration in the lumen, we probably end up blaming it for the chest pain. So a lot of work still needs to be done in this regard. So these are the trials: the CT Stat, ROMICAT, Acrin PA, Prospect. All of it looked at this problem. So, like I said, the negative predictive value was very high. These trials uniformly found that the patient satisfaction was very, very high with CCT. Patients are much more happier if the CT was normal at discharge. So, a CATS trial looked at patients who presented with this low to intermediate probability to the emergency room. CCTA was compared with the standard of care, which could be any of the other modalities. It was found that patients who initially underwent a CCTA could risk stratify. When they were looked at 19 months post discharge from the emergency room, it was found that they had a significant reduction in the MACE. Prospect trial looked at CCTA versus NPI, and the primary outcome was a little different. They actually looked at the rate of invasive coronary angiogram without revascularization at 1 year. That is, the patients who have a non-diagnostic coronary angiogram at 1 year of follow-up, who are not revascularized. So there was really no difference between these two. So when it comes to using a CT for in an acute scenario, acute setup, it still needs a lot more work, which is, again, I'll come to CTFFR later. Maybe CTFFR may be of some help. So triple rule out, as we all know, can help in stratifying coronary artery disease, pulmonary embolism, and aortic restriction in patients who come with acute chest pain. So this recent article in JACC, Linde et al., they looked at CCTA in patients with NSTEMI, a good number of patients with NSTEMI. The final conclusion was it was good to rule out clinically significant coronary artery disease. So how about CCTA in stable coronary artery disease? So stable coronary artery disease historically has been looked at from two different viewpoints. One is the anatomic lesion classification differentiation. The other is a physiologic concept where we do SPECT, PET, MPI, etc. to look at the burden of ischemia. So there have been two trials for coronary CT angiogram in patients with stable ischemic heart disease. They were PROMISE and SPOT Heart, almost published simultaneously in Lancet and NEJM in 2015 respectively. So the conclusion was that the CCTA is at least as effective as standard of care when it comes to stratifying patients with stable ischemic heart disease. So what did they look at? So these are two interesting and differently conducted studies. So PROMISE actually looked at 10,000 patients. They underwent CCTA or SPECT, followed up for 25 months. And in that 25 months of follow-up, it was found that there was really no difference in the primary endpoint, whether you did CCTA at admission or you did a functional test at admission, there was no difference when it comes to the major adverse cardiac events. But however, an interesting info from this trial was that in patients who underwent CCTA, the total number of patients who subsequently underwent cardiac catheterization who ended up actually showing obstructive CAT was 170. But when it was the other group, the functional testing group, the numbers were high. So the authors sort of ended up concluding that CCTA probably will predict patients who have non-obstructive CAD in some point in the future. So there's been a recent promise. In this, the investigators additionally looked at high-risk plaque morphologies. So if patients had a high-risk plaque in the CT, they found that this increases MACE. And this especially was found to be true in patients who had non-obstructive CAT and in low-risk patients. So when you are low risk with some chest pain, when you have high-risk plaque morphology, this was found to increase MACE, at least in the PROMISE subset. Scott Hart, again, was a very interesting study done in Scotland. 4,000 patients who had suspected angina due to CHP. They were stratified into two groups. One is the standard of care, in which any investigation could be done to the stratify other than CT. It included SPECT, it could just be medical management. The investigators were actually encouraged to use the ASSIGN score, which is the Scottish score for risk stratification. The other group were patients who were combined CT and standard of care. These patients were subjected to these tests, followed up for 6 weeks. At 6 weeks, the physicians were asked to review the patients, and this review was done with the CT report in hand. It was found that in patients who underwent a CT, the certainty of CAD diagnosis increased, and when the diagnosis changed, so did the management plan. So most of these patients with probable coronary lesions were subjected to more invasive coronary angiogram. They ended up getting more revascularization. It reduced further stress testing. It increased the usage of FFR in the further subsets. But unfortunately, it did not really translate to primary outcomes, that is death from CAD or non-fatal MI. But we have to understand that coronary artery angiogram per se, it's just a test. It is not going to improve outcomes, just by itself. So all these patients who underwent CT-CAG who had a lesion actually ended up substantially a higher rate of utilization of preventive issues like aspirin, statin. The usage was very high in this patients who underwent a CCTA. So when they looked at the 5-year outcome in 2018, it was found that there was a significant reduction in the primary endpoint in patients who underwent CCTA versus patients who had just standard of care. This was primarily because of increased use. There was a 4-fold increase in use, in fact, of aspirin and statin in this subset. So moving on to at least the guidelines, the recent guidelines, there's a class 1 indication for CT, especially in patients who, as an initial test to diagnose CAD in patients. Also, CT is not supposed to be used. I mean, we all know this, but just briefly. When the patients have extensive calcification, when the heart rate is irregular, obese patients, breath holding is not possible, any other comorbidity is a class 3. And coronary artery calcium obviously cannot be used to diagnose coronary artery disease. It can only be used as a risk factor. So this is something we have to understand. So this was their algorithm again given in that CCS guidelines. So when a patient comes with chest pain, so who gets a CT, who gets an invasive coronary angiogram? So patients who have a low clinical likelihood of ACS, if the patients are thin-walled, men, not women, not obese, these are the patients who can get a very good image quality. If there is an information on atherosclerosis beside, as I mentioned, the prognostication of the plaques, and if the patients have had no prior history of CAD, because all the previous trials actually excluded this subgroup, coronary CTA is probably recommended. But if any of these is not present, then we probably have to go ahead and do an invasive coronary angiogram. So this was about ACS and stable ischemic heart disease in coronary angiogram. So how does CT-CAD help in patients with a CTO? So there are CTOs, again, as Dinku has already discussed at length, a very interesting subset of patients. So CTCA can help in procedure planning. So we can actually look at the extent of lesion, length of the lesion, tortuosity of the vessel. We can look at the morphology of the plaque, calcium. We can look at the calcium. We can come to a conclusion of how the distal vessel collaterals are. And ostial occlusions are very often missed by invasive coronary angiogram. And these ostial occlusions can be picked up by doing a CT. So this is for the pre-procedure planning. The second point where the CT can be used in patients with a CTO is by helping us predict procedural success. So the score which has been proposed is the CT Rector score. Has a lot of points. It's just similar to the CTO, right? JCTO, etc. Some of their scores. So it includes things like occlusions, bluntness of the stump, extent of calcification, the angle, attempt, whether it's a second attempt, first attempt, etc. Whether there's a previous failed PCI, and the duration of CTO if we have a previous angiogram. So based on presence or absence, we can actually come to a conclusion of the CT Rector score. So this was how it is. Anything more than 3 is a very difficult population. So CTOs, it can help in procedure planning, procedural prediction. And in the cath lab, it's a very interesting way to use a CT. We can do something called as a fusion imaging, wherein we can actually select the ideal projection in order to go ahead with a CTO procedure. Because many of the times, there'll be a lot of foreshortening, collaterals foreshortening. We don't know where the collaterals originate from. So by a CT, we can actually plan the procedure properly, choose the proper angulations and projections, and obviously go ahead do the CTO. So we can also, CT can help in pre-procedure assessment, whether what kind of a guideway we need, what kind of a debulking device we probably have to take, etc. So post revascularization, we can do things like CT perfusion and CT FFR to find out if we have actually properly done but this is a stretch because you can just do an FFR post procedure if you really want to. So that was about CT coronary angiogram in chest pain and in CTOs. Moving on to coronary physiology. This is in 2 parts. Part 1 is CT FFR, part 2 is CT perfusion. So what is CT FFR and how can we assess physiology by using CT scan? So like we know, 2/3 of patients who have a SPECT, and the SPECT tells you that there is a significant disease and we go ahead do a invasive coronary angiogram. 2/3 of these angiograms end up non-obstructive. So this is where CT FFR can probably help in order to avoid all this business. So what we do is we do a CT angiogram, just like what we normally do for all the patients. It is a 3-vessel FFR is then done with this data set. I'll tell how it is done. There is no extra radiation, no extra contrast, no extra usage of any drugs. The same CT data set is used. So this probably forms the holy grail for non-invasive anatomic as well as functional imaging. So this has been described earlier, very high negative predictive value, very low positive predictive value for a conventional CT. So an inclusion of a physiologic testing like the CT FFR probably will improve the positive predictive value. That's the idea. So what is the technique? So right now, the problem with the CT FFR is almost the data sets which we get from a routine CT has to actually be sent to this company which does it. So there's one company right now which the FDA has approved who's doing the CT FFR. It's called as a HeartFlow based out of California. So we have to give the data set to those guys in order for them to analyze. Of course, newer vendors are coming. So this, as it is right now, it's an offline tool. It is not done on site. We have to send it to them in order to get the data. So this is FFR, as we know, is PD by PA. So CT FFR, we don't use the conventional pressure wires. So we have to rely on few computational flow dynamic algorithms. So we have to come to 3 assumptions before we end up calculating a CT FFR. So what are those? First assumption or first point corollary is that baseline coronary flow depends on the total oxygen demand. We know this. So the total oxygen demand depends on the myocardial mass. So by using this two, we can understand that if we can, so the total resting flow can then be calculated using the total ventricular mass. So if the ventricular mass is more, then that means that the resting flow is more. If the ventricular mass is less, that means the total resting flow of that artery, which is supplying that specific myocardium, is less. This is the first assumption. The second assumption is the total microcirculatory resistance at rest is actually inversely proportional to the size of the feeding vessel. So if the total microcirculatory distal bed resistance is less, this means that there is a rush of blood, there is more blood flowing into that territory, which probably means that the vessel supplying this territory is a big vessel. So this is the second assumption. So the third assumption is that, again, this is based on doing FFR and CT on a large number of patients, normal patients, patients with lesions. It has been found that the microcirculation has a very predictable response to hyperemia by either adenosine, what have you. So it's got a very predictable response to hyperemia. So this predictable hyperemic response has been calculated from data sets, and this has been computed. So based on these three assumptions, that is the baseline flow depends on the total amount of myocardium, the size of the feeding vessel actually depends on the total blood flow, and this total blood flow is high when the total resistance is low, and that there is a predictable response to hyperemia of the myocardial bed. Using these three assumptions and by a lot of mathematical and computational tools, and using the software of heart flow, CTFFR value can be generated. So this is a very interesting tool, which I'm hopeful that will come into fruition soon. So what is the evidence? There have been a lot of trials which have been done. I'm just going to mention the name of the trials because all numbers were 50 patients, 60 patients. You don't have to know the detail. Syntax 2 FFR was the first one, which actually validated versus IFR. Then in the real world population, there have been a lot of trials done. Platform is one in which it was found that when in patients with stable ISDs, when CT-FFR was used, it actually helped in deferring invasive coronary angiogram in 73% of the patients, which is a significant number. This was just an example of CT-FFR in action. Here we can see in this picture that from this point onwards where there is actual lesion, which is, the FFR is less. In this picture post revascularization, we can see that the flow is improved and the FFR is better. So Pacific FFR looked at whether CT plus FFR could be better than a SPECT, and it was found that it was better. So Emerald was another trial which actually looked at patients with ACS who have had a plaque rupture, and if CT-FFR can be used in this subset for risk stratification, and it was a positive trial. They could actually risk stratify properly. So these were some of the trials: Discover Flow, DeFacto, NextD. I think we just need to know the names. We don't probably have to know the in and outs of it. So what are the issues with FFR-CT? The first problem is it's offline, like I said. So online is still under review. There are a lot of problems with the quality of the CTs which are done. So Pacific CT-FFR, there was a 25% CTCS which could never be read. The DeFacto, Discover, all these trials had 10 to 15% of CTs which could not be read. So if there is a lot of coronary artery calcium, the FFR value which we get is not correct. So FFR is probably good in the intermediate range, that is 50 to 70%. But how about its use in more than 70% blue mineral stenosis? Studies are yet to be done. Cost right now as it stands is very expensive. So the standard deviation is about 0.07, around the 0.8 cutoff. So there still exists a very mild and a minor gray zone, wherein CT-FFR is probably unreliable in the 0.73 to 0.87 probably. So future trials are underway. Decision is comparing FFR-CT to IFR. So guidelines, interestingly, the UK NICE guidelines have actually recommended that we use CT-FFR. They have, it's a purely economical question for them, where they have actually done studies which prove that a good 9 or some significant millions of pounds could be saved if an upfront CT-FFR was done over a upfront invasive coronary angiography. So in the UK, it has been approved already. So the FDA approved tool is just the heart flow. Siemens, Canon, all of them are coming out with other protocols, but FDA is not approved them yet. What about CTFFR for acute chest pain? So as I mentioned, the Emerald study has already looked at it in subset of patients with ACS. This was, I think, recently, last month or some weeks back, published in JACC, where they looked at FFRCT in patients presenting to the emergency room with acute chest pain. It was found that FFRCT was very good in triaging patients and identifying patients by Dr. Kavita Pannad. So moving on to the next physiologic assessment tool, which is the CT perfusion imaging. So this is of two types, static and dynamic. We don't have to really go into the nitty-gritty of it, but it is nothing but doing an MPI by simple contrast CT. So it is done at rest. The CT is done at rest. CT is done under stress, and the images are analyzed. It is very similar to the stress MRI or the MPI. The technique is as follows. An initial contrast injection is done, and this contrast is then seen to perfuse the myocardium. Once the myocardial perfusion starts, there are three possibilities. One, it can hypoattenuate the myocardium. It can have a normal attenuation of the myocardium, or it can have a non-enhancement. So based on principles like this, we can actually visually look at the contrast as it courses into the myocardium. Something like the thing in my blush trade and all. So based on this, we can come to a conclusion of the total perfusion. So the protocol used is the stress followed by rest imaging, or the rest followed by stress imaging. So the rest followed by stress is preferred. Here initially at the rest phase, a simple CT-CCTA is done. Any anatomical obstructions are ruled out. 15 minutes is given, at which time patients are started on adenosine. Then the stress images are taken. And this stress imaging is only done if there is an anatomically intermediate lesion. If there is a significant stenosis, stress protocol is not followed. If there is no stenosis, stress protocol is probably not followed. So as I said, visually it is estimated. But what if there was another better way to look at perfusion? So this was the transmural perfusion ratio. This has been compared with the visual estimation, and it has been proven that visual is in fact better. But here, what they do is they look at subendocardial perfusion, then they look at subepicardial attenuation. And for the 17 segment, like what we discussed earlier for the MRI, for all 17 segments, this ratio is plotted. And then it gives a global value, the transmural perfusion global value. But again, like I said, visual estimation was probably better than the TPR. So there has been a lot of evidence coming up now, including a meta-analysis which gave a reasonable sensitivity compared to SPECT and MRI. The Advantage study looked at post-PCI patients. In this subgroup, CTP was found to improve the diagnostic accuracy. And I believe that CT perfusion will probably have its reckoning in post-PCI patients, because that's where a lot of studies are being done right now. So MR Inform compared CTP versus stress MR, and again, the same post-PCI patients, found that it was equal. So the future of coronary imaging by CT would be something like this, where we do a CTCA, then CTFFR, and a CT perfusion to give a complete picture. These are just illustrative examples. And even in the examples, you can see that it was a post-PCI patient. And here we can see that there is a significant amount of scar. This is perfused myocardium. This part of the myocardium is not perfused. So this, moving on to the last part, which is CT in structural heart disease. So I'll be having very few pages left. Briefly, we can calculate the LVF by using CT. CT is upcoming for diagnosis and even stratification for HOCM. Aortic valve area can be adequately identified. CT calcium can be used for aortic stenosis, the low risk variants. AR can be quantified. We all know that we can calculate LV stroke volume, RV stroke volume. The difference will give the AR volume. So mitral valve assessment by using newer post-processing methods can actually be identified. EROA can be calculated. So this we know, paravalvular leak, prosthetic dehiscence, thrombus. So again, structural heart diseases, the CT is probably mostly used in two points. One is the TAVI, the second one is LA appendage closure. So we'll just briefly look at what it does in patients who are undergoing TAVI. So CT is now standard of care. All the protocols recommend that CT be done before the tower is proceeded. So we can look at aortic annular size. We can size the processes. Aortic area can be identified. Things like annular or alveotic calcium, which is very important prior to doing a TAVI, can be identified by a CT scan. This is important. So based on a CT, we can come to a conclusion on the deployment angles. That is what projection ideally gives a good angle to deploy. There are a lot of methods which people use fluoroscopically, things like lucent line, etc. But even better than that, CT can give a very good projection angle. And in fact, it's a standard of care even now. Coronary ostial heights, as we all know, is very important prior to implantation. This can only be obtained by doing a CT. Considering that all TAVIs right now are done transfemorally, aorta and iliac size and the total atherosclerotic burden in the lower leg vessels are important prior to transfemoral punctures. In post-TAVR patients, we have to, and Dinpu has already discussed this in the prosthetic valve discussion, but just to reiterate, there are specific CT markers and specific CT terminologies for a post-TAVR valve thrombosis. So this is the HALT, which stands for hypoattenuated valve thickening, which this thickening actually starts at the base of the leaflets and then it proceeds inwards. So this is a sign of probable valve thrombosis. The second one is HAM. HAM stands for hypoattenuation, but this affects motion. HALT does not affect motion, but HAM affects motion. So we do a 4D CT, which is again why 4D CT is important in this subgroup of patients. If there is a reduction of valve motion in the systolic frames compared to the diastolic frame by at least 50%, which this probably means there is a probable subclinical valve thrombosis. The gradients may be a little high, patients may be asymptomatic, but they may have valve thrombosis. And this valve thrombosis has been correlated to subsequent valve degeneration. So that is why a lot of studies are now looking at anticoagulation for this. RELM is very similar to HAM, nothing but reduction of leaflet motion. The leaflet motion can be a mild reduction, which is less than 50%, or a significant reduction, more than 50%. Or of course, HALT and HAM and RELM can only be done by doing a 4D echo, 4D CT. Sorry. Like I said, transmitral valve replacement. Although mitral is a very fast-moving structure, it is difficult to see the mitral valve clearly in a CT. Newer methods, the MIN IP projection, as I mentioned, the double oblique CT, all of these can actually very well reconstruct the mitral valve, and this can help in guiding you further prosthetic mitral valves. In LA appendage closure, like the TAVI, CT is standard of care. No LA appendage closure ever happens without CT being done. So this is used to exclude clot and is also used to assess the size and shape of the left atrial appendage. In patients who are undergoing ablations for AF and VT, we can plan ablation, and we can also do a co-registration where we fuse the images of CT onto the fluoro screen, and with that we can better ablate. So that brings an end to the discussion.
Varun, extensive.
Hello?
Nice.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
You had incidentally a radiologist attending your talk.
Oh, who? Oh, okay. I get it.
Yeah. Anyway.
Tina, hi, if you're around.
Hi, Varun.
Varun,
Yeah, Gautam. Yeah. You
Varun?
can direct questions to the radiologist, man. Don't ask me.
no, Varun. Thing is that regarding CT-FFR and myocardial perfusion, like myocardial perfusion, what advantage it has like over CT-FFR?
You mean CT perfusion?
CT perfusion, yeah. CT
No,
perfusion.
CT-FFR is only going to give you the FFR values. It is not going to give scar quantification. It's not going to tell you when you do for example, I told you, as I said, CTP is mostly been used in patients who have already undergone
Procedure.
PCI. Yeah.
PCI.
So
Okay,
in that subgroups, yeah, pretty much all the studies right now are looking at that subgroup specifically.
Okay,
So,
okay. So it's only after procedure, just like
No,
myocardial
no. It
flush
can be used even prior.
prior.
There is probably more reason to use post procedure.
Post
That's all. Yeah, to look at how well the subtended myocardium is perfused and
procedure.
things like that.
But this CT perfusion doesn't imply regarding this viability, I think, no? Like it's only depicts about the perfusion, similar to MP, this perfusion imaging.
Not really. I think it can also say. I mean, I'm not, really read
It
too
is
much about
similar
it.
to
But
like spec, no? It will be.
yeah,
I think only perfusion it tells, not the viability.
probably. It's a little difficult to say that, but perfusion is well documented.
Do we do it, Varun? Here? No.
No, man, no. We don't do it.
No CTFFR, no this.
We don't do proper CTs. I don't think.
Dimpu,
Yeah.
Dimpu, ನಿಂದು CTFFR where you sent?
Hey, yeah. See, my
We have to
study.
send it to. Yeah, so only the heart flow guys do it right now.
Correct.
So we have to actually send it to them in order to get your CTs analyzed, and it's got a lot of cost threshold to clear. So right now, Siemens and Toshiba, I mean Canon has purchased Toshiba. So these two guys have come up with their own online protocols wherein you can actually get a CTFFR value right away. You don't really have to wait for all this analysis to happen. But the FDA has not approved it. It is probably only under research protocols now. So maybe once it comes, then it makes things easier. And in fact, the only review article, proper one on JAC on CTFFR is written by the guy who started HeartFlow. So they're the monopoly on it right now.
That's what this basically our Rahul Patil and the scam. What it is about is actually Nimans,
Data
their
sets.
bioengineering department is actually trying to emulate that CFG, right? Computer flow dynamic algorithm. Using so they have generated Jayadeva has generated 25 numbers of normal CTs and also normal coronary FFRs also. Like all 3 vessels CT, all 3 vessels FFR has been submitted as a part of that algorithm to that actually. So it's a multi-center
at a monetary cost
So they are developing the algorithm.
Yeah. Same thing what Varun is saying basically is that that heart flow thing, no? Similar to that, they're trying to come up with an indigenous algorithm, but
Immense thing. Okay.
ಆಗಲ್ಲಪ್ಪ ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ.
No, the thing is for dementia.
For thesis ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಇದೆ ಹಾಗಾದ್ರೆ.
Hey, my thesis is a part of that. It's not that CTFFR is basically Ashita is a PI for that CTFFR thing actually. Not why will they include me?
All these people who are involved except Dimpu just makes. I mean, I think even the director had written it off right from the beginning.
Yeah, I know.
Ashita, Rahul Patil.
No, the thing is, Nimhans gets.
Legends are involved.
Varshit, you were saying?
Nimhans gets 5 crore grant simply for studying dementia. And in the dementia, they study some genes, some nonsense genes, and that too they study half-heartedly. So it never makes an impact. So this is what happens with all these studies also.
Yeah. Varun, that proposed algorithm which you have mentioned, no, about CT, that that interesting picture you had, right? That statins can be used even in 1 to 99. That's there, no? CAC.
Yeah.
That has been incorporated into the primary prevention algorithm in AHA, basically. So the same thing, exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's come into the guideline 2A or 2B, I think, basically. Just Gautam Edji was discussing it sometime back. I think we're not having the other one, no? Anyways, it's done, right? I mean, it's 11 already.
That depends on Varshit, really. But yeah, I think we're done. Varshit?
No, it will be DVT will be a long topic. No, it has some concepts.
Yeah. That's what. No, I think.
And May Turner is smaller topic, but May Turner better to discuss after DVT.
After DVT is done. Yeah.
Varun, tomorrow Subramanian, I mean, what is this? Anand sir is basically free to come for 40 minutes, he said. 40 to 1 hour. 40 minutes to 1 hour. So we'll have only one talk. He was asking us the time. So that's why I thought I'll discuss. What time? 4:35 I thought was okay tomorrow.